Hey everyone, welcome to the Psyched to Practice podcast, your one stop for practical and useful clinical information, masterful insight from experts in the field, and a guide to daily living. I'm Ray Christner, and with me,
Paul Wagner.
And we're so glad you're joining us today for another Masters in Practice episode. And Paul and I had this just great opportunity to talk with a dear friend of mine, Dr. John Murphy, about solution-focused counseling.
Yeah, and certainly earned the title of Masters in Practice, and just his demeanor, from what he was sharing with early childhood pieces, it sounds like whether he knew it or not, there was a solution-focused air for him, throughout his life, and certainly as he got into psychology, it sounds like he was able to put that into practice and really help out a lot of individuals. So it's such a pleasure and just so insightful to be able to talk with him.
Yeah. And I one thing I think every time I talk to John, and I've had the privilege of knowing him for many years, and it's interesting because every time we talk, there's this little nugget of information that I tuck away and go, oh man, I'm using that. One of the things I think he did so well as we talked today was he just kept giving all these ways of wording questions for people. So as he was answering our questions, he was like, well, you would ask a question like this, or you would ask a question like that. And I was like, wow, that's just such useful, practical knowledge. I think listeners will have a great opportunity to pull some things from. And, so Paul, what's kind of your takeaway from this episode?
So for me, the idea, and he talks about working collaboratively and client directed, and one of the points he was sharing is that with solution focus, it's not that the clinician isn't coming up with new ideas, but that truly wanting to be invited by the client rather than prescribing ideas and solutions for the client, and how that can make such a difference to be told what to do rather than working collaboratively to explore a solution. And, that was something that really stuck out for me, and wanting to make sure that I'm applying in the future.
Yeah. And, there were a lot of different things that John said that were kind of like, I was thinking like, this is a good takeaway for me. I think one of the things I kind of inferred from what he said that really just, I think is just the overall episode is, this goal and solution focused counseling is working with someone to find what do they want to do instead of whatever that problematic behavior is. And so our focus isn't trying to answer the question of why is it happening? It's what we're going to do instead of. And that kind of kept coming through with different parts. And, something I think we always have to keep in mind, like what's that outcome that we're shooting for? So, great episode. For those of you who don't know Dr. John Murphy, he's been a professor for a number of years at the University of Arkansas, and now is retired. And really, most of his work's writing and doing presenting. And we talk about a new book that he has that came out, which is Solution Focused Counseling in School. It's now in its 4th edition, published by the ACA. And I would encourage anybody to read it.
And with that, we hope you enjoy this Masters in Practice episode, Solutions Focused Therapy with Dr. John Murphy.
So, John, thanks so much for joining us on the Psyched to Practice podcast. We're really excited to pull some insights from you today.
It's so good to be here. I look forward to the conversation.
Great. Well, and it really is a privilege. I feel like I've known you for a long time, and we've had such great conversations that never have been recorded. I'm excited that we're going to actually kind of have this now to archive, which is really good. I wish I, carried a tape in some of our past interactions. So This should be fun.
Yeah. Likewise, Ray.
Great. So John, before we kind of get into the content of solution-focused counseling, we like for our listeners to kind of get a little background story about our guests and really kind of, see how people got to where they're at in their careers. So I guess maybe just kind of starting off, can you tell us a little bit what led you to work in mental health and to get into psychology?
What a great question. Of course, I don't know the full answer to that, but I'll take a stab at some things that I speculate might have pushed me in that direction. Well, without being cliche, I mean, I'll start with my parents, who neither of whom were in any human service profession. Well, I suppose parenting could definitely be considered one. Yeah.
Right.
5 kids, and I was the youngest, and so I guess you'd say they implemented a longitudinal mental health intervention. And it turned out, I guess, the data came out pretty good. We all stumbled into adulthood with, reasonably intact psychologically and otherwise. And, but, on a more serious note with my parents, my mother was, without using these words, she just modeled just kind of, I think, giving people the benefit of the doubt, seeing the best in people. And again, she never said that stuff explicitly, but just kind of being around that. My dad was a pragmatist, a tool and die maker. And if he didn't have a tool that he needed, he would make it on a lathe in the garage. And so that pragmatic aspect has definitely stayed with me. And but we may come back to that when we talk about solution focused work, which is, if nothing else, it's very pragmatic. And, and so there was that, but I think probably, my mother's brother, and my uncle, came to live with us when we were 10, and he was born with cerebral palsy in around 1920. And back then they gave him about 2 or 3 years to live, and 59 years later, he died. And so he came to live with us and spent his life in a wheelchair. And, again, it was a matter of fact. It was like, well, Uncle Tom was his name. Uncle Tom was living with us. And my dad ended up somehow, kind of improvising this bathroom on the ground floor, which was amazing because there were seven of us in this modest house, and here comes Uncle Tom, and everybody that was the way it was. And I think that sense, when I think back, just accommodating a person who didn't have some of the abilities that others had physically, and language wise. And so again, without really making a big deal of it, I think it enhanced my sort of, not just sensitivity to, but I enjoyed helping him. I didn't, and it was just natural. And so maybe in general, that might have tilted me toward helping professions, the service professions, and maybe in particular into school psychology. That obviously we work with people that may need a boost in some area of life to level the playing field a bit. And that's what we tried to do for my uncle. And I think basically, in my career, I've tried to maybe give people a better chance to, have opportunities to grow and experience life with as level a playing field as possible. So those are just a couple things, offhand.
So did you enter college knowing you wanted to be a psychologist?
Absolutely not.
Okay.
When I say absolutely not, I mean, it wasn't, I didn't know anything about psychology, and again, I mean, my high school didn't have psychology courses.
Right.
And so I will say my brother, my older brother, Larry, majored in psychology. I don't think he knew either, but he eventually majored, and he was about 6 years older than me. And so, I knew that, but when I went into college, and I think I picked like sociology, just because I had to put something on the line,
Right.
which is a whole interesting concept about expecting, 17 or 18-year-olds to know, or, but that's another discussion. But
Yeah.
I just took psych as one of my general ed courses, and within about 2 months into that, I thought, this stuff is fun. It's not work. And so early on, I remember reading about psychology, thinking that I almost had to force myself to read my other subject matters, because and this is general psychology, so that gives you a hint at how geeky I guess I was about psychology. And the nice thing was, it wasn't my major, and so it was more of a organic, spontaneous resonation with the material of psychology, and I just thought it was all fascinating, and that included rods and cones in the eye, and sensation and perception, all the way through the social psychology and learning and all that stuff. So it was a nice accidental kind of a connection, and that was it, man. I said, all I want to do is take psychology, and of course they said, well, you can't do that. You got to do other things. And I did. And so I minored in English, which at the time I just picked something that I thought I could tolerate, along with psychology. And as it turned out, that has been an interesting little fold in my life and career, because I really enjoyed. I took a creative writing course, and of course, creative writing is not like academic writing or that sort of thing, but it ended up sort of planting a seed, I think, that has come to be something that I've also found gratifying and enjoyable. So yeah, that's the story about psychology.
Yeah, it's interesting that, when we talk to people that get into this field, although there's differences, we all have a lot of similarities. It's like no one thinks that that's what they're going to do. And then when you love it, you love it. And it's, so it's kind of interesting to hear you kind of have a very similar path in that way.
Yeah. Well, if you're lucky enough, that's, I'm really grateful for that, because obviously we all know folks that, that don't have those opportunities to have a career, a vocation or profession that they just resonate with and really love. And so, I've tried to stay actively grateful and appreciative of that.
So John, like when, we all kind of have these people in our training that become these inspirational, I guess, guides for our career. Who were some people that really kind of were inspirational in kind of where you've developed in your career?
Yeah. Well, one was not necessarily in my graduate program, but so I went to grad school in school psychology. I taught high school. I was teaching high school at the time, and and lucky enough, my high school did not have a psychology course, but when they hired me, they were implementing psychology. So I got to develop the curriculum, and I worked in this high school, Highlands High School in Northern Kentucky. And the school psychologist, I didn't know they had such thing, but was named Joe Zins, Z-I-N-S. And Joe was adjunct at University of Cincinnati across the Ohio River from where I was working. And actually, I was born and raised in Cincinnati, and he was working in this Northern Kentucky school district at the time. And Joe who went on to publish a lot of things in consultation, in school psychology and prevention. He kind of latched on to me because he said, well, this guy knows psychology. And so he stopped by a few months after I started teaching high school and said, well, we should meet for coffee and just talk psychology. And I'm like, hey, that sounds great. And so anyway, so I'd say probably that he was my first kind of mentor, because he said, well, have you ever thought about going further? And I said, well, yeah, I'd probably like clinical psychology. And I think I'd enjoy working with people and, the counseling therapy end. And he said, yeah, I mean, I could see you doing that. But he said, you really should think about this thing called school psychology. And I listened because he said, I know you like teaching and you seem to enjoy that and be pretty good at it and stuff. And I said, well, I never thought of that. He said, talk to this guy named Mike Curtis, who was the chair of the University of Cincinnati School Psych program at the time. And so I did. And then that's, the rest of that is kind of the way I stayed on that road. So there's Joe, and Dave Barnett was also a faculty member at Cincinnati. And I've always thought, you can learn content from books and things like that, but mindsets, principles, kind of just how dispositional aspects of the work, I think mentors are particularly important. And one thing I learned from Dave was a real child advocacy focus. And I mean, he never let up on that. And he was so stringent about reviewing your reports for making sure that you were casting and writing about children, in this case at Head Start, because we did a lot of work with preschool at the time, and making sure that what we said engaged people in working with the child. And that term has stayed with me. It's not candy coating or diminishing weaknesses or downplaying struggles, but it's framing and presenting and discussing a child in a way that engages people to work with the child. And again, that may not sound like immediately like, oh, well, that's directly tied to strengths-based or solution-focused work. But for me, it absolutely is. And it's respecting people. It's, again, trying to tell the whole story, not just the deficit weakness story. And so Dave was instrumental in really instilling that kind of a mindset. And then after graduate school, I was working full time, and I did a postdoc with Barry Duncan at the at the Institute for Family Therapy in Dayton, Ohio. And Barry has been since then a major mentor for me. He had just written a book called Changing the Rules, subtitled A Client-Directed Approach to Therapy. And that's where I came into contact with the common factors of therapeutic change, client factors, relationship, hope, model technique, therapist factors, those kinds of things. And Michael Lambert's research was instrumental in that kind of introduction. This was 1990. And Barry and I just hit it off really well. And we continue to be great friends and colleagues. And he continues to be a mentor to me. And when I say that, he said, oh, you're just as much a mentor to me, and I'm like, no, you've got it all wrong. But, what Barry did is he instilled a client-directed respect that is just unswerving. It's it's just in everything that he has done and written about. He's a clinician at heart. I feel the same way. Even when I moved to academics, I still feel, I always said I identified always more as a practitioner than an academic. And that seemed to help me as an academic, whatever that means. I think there's a great interplay between theory and practice and research and practice and so on. And so Barry has been a huge mentor. We've worked on several projects, and I just consider it just one of the highlights of my career. And so in all my books, I put that just front center in my acknowledgments, and that sense of keeping the client centered in the service and centralizing the client's resources, impressions, feedback has always been instrumental, and I'm very appreciative of those people.
Yeah, and you're hearing that, and knowing your writings, that always seems like it comes through those concepts that that client directedness, and I guess maybe that leads us into maybe what the meat of what we want to talk about today, and that's solution focused counseling. And I shared with Paul, really that's kind of how I got to know you, and probably before we actually ever met. Somebody showed me a video of you and I think John Carlson many years ago doing some work together. And I went, wow, this is like really great. And then, over time had a chance to, get to, see you present and get to know you more personally. And, I think what I always appreciate is that client forward approach into what you do. So I guess maybe let's kind of get in and talk a little bit about solution focused counseling. And for people who maybe aren't as familiar with it, can you kind of give us what is solution focused counseling? How do you describe it to people?
Yes. Solution focused counseling, it's a collaborative approach that invites clients to describe what they want from services and what they already have toward achieving it in the shortest time possible. So there's a lot in there. The collaborative, and I'd also say, client-directed approach that invites, and that's another well-chosen word, it's invitational, invites clients to describe what they want from services. So that's where everything starts. It's questions like, what are your best hopes from this? What are your best hopes from meeting with me, from talking with me today? And, that's a little different kind of a first question than a more assessment directed mindset that might say, well, tell me what brings you here. And typically that, of course, in our work is going to be a discussion of the struggle and the problem. And really even asking about what your best hopes are from this also leads to that kind of discussion. And that's fine. But let's just finish this part, this definition kind of description. So we definitely want to find out what the client wants from the service. And then we want to try to draw on what the client brings to the table that might help them move in that direction of their hopes and their goals. The shortest time possible, it is more of a byproduct of working this way. I'm never thinking brief when I'm with clients. I've never put a limit on number of contacts or sessions. But it just so happens that it seems like being very mindful of trying to build on what the clients already have in their lives in the form of natural resources, values, strengths, social supports, these what I call natural resources in their lives, is going to move things along, because it's not like we have to start from scratch and give them something they don't already have. We're trying to, again, be very intentional about seeking those out, discovering those resources, and collaborating and partnering with students, teachers, parents, whoever the client is. I just use the word client for anybody who's sitting in front of you, and working with them to try and, recruit and connect those resources to a movement toward the goal.
It's a year ago we did a podcast episode that we called Words Matter, and as you were talking, one of the things that really kind of has always struck me with when I hear you talk about therapy is that by changing the question from what brings you here today to what are your hopes from what you're going to get, truly changes that narrative of the person in front of you. So, I mean, what brings you here today? They're going to describe all the problems that they have. What do you hope you're going to get from this? Really, it just sets us on this positive front from our first question, which, again, so simple that how we reframe those questions, how it makes such a difference at the entry point for people.
Yeah. And, words really do matter. And a tiny phrase, a word does, again, just as you said, and that's a big distinction between solution focused and other approaches. And let me be very clear that I've never said throughout my entire writing career and workshop training ever said that solution focused is better than other approaches. That would be intellectually dishonest and really inconsistent with what the research says. And again, back to common factors, all of the bona fide evidence-based established approaches seem to work about equally well across different problems. So no one approach can claim superiority and say, the story is over, I've won. That's just not what the research says. And that fact becomes more compelling with each year of research. However, it stands shoulder to shoulder with other approaches. That includes even work with problems that a lot of people are surprised it might be effective with. And I'm talking about traumas, sexual abuse, child abuse, all the way through the continuum of what people usually categorize as traumatic experiences. And so, those words matter. And excuse me, this approach in no way ignores, minimizes, discounts, downplays the pain, the pain and the struggle of problems and the oppression of problems and the weight that it creates for people. And that's a misconception of solution-focused work. In no way does it diminish that. And I listen to that. But the big difference between solution-focused and more traditional problem-focused approaches is what happens after listening to the problem story and validating that story and conveying empathy for that struggle. And then the difference is in solution-focused counseling and therapy, the question is, what do you want instead of that? And a lot of traditional approaches would then say, ask questions along the lines of assessing the presumed causes of the approach. The causes of the problem, triggers, history, and so forth. And again, that can be useful, but it just so happens that solution focus is more interested in what people want instead of the problem, rather than exploring in more detail the problem itself. And that's where that, what do you hope to get from this, as you said, which got us onto this conversation is it really is a shift from what's the problem to really what's the hope and what's the goal and what do you want to be different as a result of talking with me.
And John, well, one thing, and you had shared this earlier on when you were sharing about what led to you working in mental health, and you shared how your father, when there was something that wasn't had, he could go out with his lathe and create that piece. And I hear how that connects even in what we're talking about, because it's not necessarily the missing piece, but it's what are the materials and what are the things that you do have. So I might not have the thing I need, but I have a means of creating it, or I have a means to get to the positive resolution rather than focusing on, oh, I don't have this, and not taking the time to really assess all of the strengths or all of the support systems that are there and how can they be best utilized. Even hearing that connection back in early childhood of how that's transcended and even with you today.
Wow. Well, aside from wanting you as a writing coach now, Paul, that observation is, beautifully said. And Milton Erickson, who really influenced Steve DeShazer and Insoo Kim Berg in developing this approach. Erickson, the psychiatrist who worked in Phoenix, Arizona most of his career, and would come up with these incredible interventions and someone that was duly diagnosed as, schizophrenia and multiple things, would be working as a CEO at Procter and Gamble, like in a month after seeing Erickson. I mean, it's crazy, outcomes, and everybody's just scratching their heads saying, what's happening here? And from what I gather, and most of the writings about Erickson's work is it's called utilization, and it's really just utilizing or using what the client offers. And so it's just what you were saying, Paul. It's Erickson often said, that was one of his expressions. You use what the client offers, and I love this. I love kind of connecting some of this to the way my dad was, and bear in mind, this man never read 2 words of psychotherapy. and really that's what makes it interesting, even to see the connections between these different disciplines, everything from physics and biology to the work that we do. But he used use what you have. I mean, you got to have something in the garage that's going to do the job. And likewise, I want to assume that even a student who's sitting in front of me, that a lot of people think may not have much at all to offer. At least let's look. And I respectfully hold open the possibility and remain curious about experiences in this person's life that we can at least build on. Now, that none of this suggests that students don't benefit from learning new skills. That's not, we know that, but it's not incompatible with that to say, let's also look for important people in their lives who may be brought into the process, either physically in meetings or kind of more just involved in the conversation. What would your grandmother advise you to do in this situation for a student who really looks up to her grandmother, and so forth? And tell me what your interests are. And, you find out that the student is great at rollerblading or skateboarding, and doing the jumps and stuff. And it's like, well, that's interesting. How did you get onto that? How did you get good at that? And, in most cases, they're going to tell you I had to work at it, and,
right.
And well, that's interesting. So in other words, it didn't just happen automatically. And did you have times you fell and said, oh, go. Yeah. How did you push through that? A lot of people would fall and just a couple times and say, that's it for that. But somehow you pushed through. How did you manage to do that? And so again, it's just trying to be alert and mindful of some of that.
John, as you're describing some of the features of solution-focused therapy, it connects with some of those pieces that you've talked about in your book, and kind of labeling those, like that section, as like the main principles or the big picture. And I'm wondering if you wouldn't mind us kind of talking about some of those specific pieces and working to apply that to some of these, I guess, how we can use solution-focused therapy, whether that's with students or in the therapy office. What are your thoughts?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, interestingly, I think one of the first, I usually put it right at the top, really dovetails right off our conversation. And that's that clients are resilient, resourceful, and capable. And it's just viewing them. Hey, everybody's resilient. I mean, if a 3-month-old baby could talk about some of the struggles and hurdles that they've encountered, they would be able to do it. And everybody has bumps on the road that they manage to circumvent or overcome. And so we know that going into it. And that's a resource that's there for everyone. That's a principle. Now, see, that's a lens, if you will, that is immediately different than looking across the table and seeing someone who is defective, and really just seeing what they lack only. Now, again, this is not denying that it's not denying problems. It's not denying that there's a way to go. There's a ways to go here, as they say. We got some work to do, and it's not going to be easy. And there are struggles and behaviors that are really interfering with this person's success. With all that in mind, to me, this approach does not restrict your vision. And that's another misunderstanding. You're just looking at strengths and ignoring what it does is expand the lens to include other aspects of a client's story. So there's the pain and the possibilities. There's the struggle and the strengths. And so that's a principle. That's a big principle that immediately at least expands the lens in which we look at people and their possibilities. Other principles include, collaboration enhances and expedites change. The research screams that we, as much as it may be tempting to, take a kid's face in our hands gently and say, get a grip here. You're going down a bad road. You need to change. And that historically has not worked well, and if it had, chances are somebody wouldn't be sitting in front of us. So I'm not suggesting that approach may not be helpful, but that's one that people usually use pretty early in the problem solving process. It's like, get a grip, change your ways, and that kind of stuff. And again, it's worth a shot maybe early on, but so collaboration and that just includes the whole respect issue, and tell me what this is like for you, and including what are your ideas about how this might change. Now, I say that in workshops and stuff, and people say, are you kidding? If the kid knew that, they wouldn't be there. And it's like, in my experience, sometimes there's so much chatter around these problems that maybe no one, including a client, let's say a student in this case, has ever just stopped, breathed, and had a chance to sit and say, what do I actually think might help turn this thing around? Because a lot of their energy is often going in to defending and justifying, as we all do, defending their position. Well, that takes energy. And if your mind is focused on defending your position, it doesn't leave a lot of room for creative problem solving and even just stopping and saying, is this really serving me? And that's where that hopes question comes in. It's just, let's just take a pause and what do you want school to look like, ideally? And, that's where that miracle question or tomorrow question comes into play is I want to invite people to describe a school situation that's not just okay, but that's downright pretty wonderful. And not with no encumbrance about how they're going to get there. But that's one thing the Milwaukee group discovered, Steve and Ensu and that group, is that the very act, this goes back to words matter too, the very act of describing what you want more of in your life seems to make that more real and possible in the mindset of the client, and also seem to correlate with them actually taking action in that direction. And so, again, that the words matter, and inviting people to talk about what they want more of seems to be more useful for a lot of people than talking about what they want less of in their lives. And so, to run through real quick, that's that's another principle. The language of solutions we've talked about is different than the language of solution building is different than the language of problem fixing or problem solving. Again, not saying, they can both be useful, but we're talking about solution focused here. So that's a difference that definitely distinguishes this approach from others. And then there's those pragmatics that if it's not broke, don't fix it, which sounds so obvious. But this says, so if no one is complaining about the child's social relationships in a referral, then don't spend time assessing the social relationships. Nobody's having a problem with it. It's hard enough to change what's in front of us and what people are complaining about. So if it's not broke, don't fix it. And if no one in that client system, teacher, parent, student, is saying this is problematic, then I'm going to honor that and let's just focus on it. So if it's not broke, don't fix it. If it doesn't work, do something different. Of course, that's all the Mental Research Institute stuff that came out of Palo Alto about, interventions that are very different than what you've done. So, sometimes after we try building on the resources and exceptions to the problem, these times when things go a little better, and try to figure out what people are doing to make those happen and encourage them to do more of it. If those things don't work, then let's try something different. What would be a very different way for you to approach the student? Something you haven't tried before. And then the real solution focused part of that, if these three pragmatic principles, is if it works, do more of it. And so that's where we try to find these small little exceptions, are called exceptions to the problem, or instances of the preferred future, if you prefer that. We're just trying to find those moments that go a little better, and then analyze and discuss those with the same level of intensity and scrutiny that we've traditionally analyzed and discussed the problematic times.
And John, as you're going over these main principles here, I can't help but hear areas from past episodes that Ray and I have talked on. And one of our more recent episodes has been one on acceptance. And when you were discussing that idea and concept of making sure that we're seeing the whole person in front of us, and it's not just the strengths, but it's also not just the problems. And if we're able to have this wider lens and seeing them fully, as well as developing this collaborative approach with them, if we're working with them instead of kind of against them, or we're we're stepping alongside, I hear that it allows for them to better accept that this is a concern. Like when you were discussing that piece where, so often students can become defensive and, trying to justify, but if we're able to take the collaborative approach and seeing them fully, they can better accept that, yeah, this is a problem. This is maybe something I'm not crazy about. And because of that question of talking about hopes, that means that I am wanting change. And so I'm needing to accept the situation and circumstances that I'm in first before I can then really work on identifying some of the potential solutions.
Yeah, beautifully said. It's, validation by just saying something like, wow, that sounds awful. I mean, sometimes that kind of statement itself, just that short, and just take somebody's mindset and say, oh, and after a few of those kind of things where you just simply acknowledge the dilemma that somebody is in, at least can shift the energy from that natural defense. And when I say, natural, it's like, we all do that. I mean, that's a, an evolutionary kind of a response, if you will. Then we can get to work on what they want to be different. So yeah, that's the idea behind that just kind of respect. And hey, some of this stuff, let's face it, and this is true of any model, it goes back to common factors. Some of this stuff is stuff our grandparents, if we were lucky enough, may have passed down, like just kind of like do unto others a little bit, I mean, to be kind. I don't know, do you like it when you say this is the way it is and somebody says that's stupid, that's wrong, well, usually we dig our heels in a little more. So some of this stuff is, we've got great words for it, like, and it's good. And, our profession has our own language, but we have these words, like empathy and validation and acknowledgement. They're long Latin, $100 words that some folks would just call be nice, just be a little nice, be kind, stuff like that. So.
When you're talking about these principles, it got me actually thinking, what many years ago, I saw you present and you did a little role play activity, and you were role playing an interview with a parent, and you had asked a question in that session that truly has changed how I do therapy. I say it almost every time with someone, and it was simply this: and I'm going to paraphrase it. It probably wasn't exactly like this, but you asked the parent, tell me about when your child doesn't have the problems that you're talking about. Tell me when these things aren't an issue. And I remember in the role play, it threw the person off when you asked the question. But I think it's such a powerful, when you're talking about this resiliency and things of that nature, like, boy, it's so easy for us to get into all the bad things and just simply like, when does your child not have an attention problem? When do they control their anger really well? And so ever since I've seen you do that, I it's in every session, whether it's a child or an adult, I ask that question, and it's such a game changer. When you look at it and go, look, you are successful some of the time. How do we expand that, right? How do we get it from only being that you're successful when you're playing video games? How do we branch that on into other parts of life where, you don't lose your cool in this situation? How do we get that to happen at school? And, it sounds so simple, but I think, when we think about it, but it's also so elegant at the same time to do that, to be able to just take that and those simple questions and how that builds up. And, I as you were talking, I was saying, I just had a intake with a family the other day, and I asked that question, and this kid just didn't want to be here. Like, it was like he was in the office, and it was like, he just didn't want to. And when I said, I said, Mom and Dad, so tell me, like, when are the times these problems don't happen? When are the times he does his best? And as soon as they started talking about it, it completely changed his demeanor. He sits up. He's listening for the first time to what they're going to say. And that simple build on that resilient piece, that piece that he was successful, it gave us a springboard to move forward. So these big picture, I really do think they're big picture. I appreciate you saying them because I think they're such important concepts that just simply incorporating these things and paying attention to them, it just changes people's perceptions.
Yeah, that's a beautiful example, and also illustrates that some of the techniques that come from this approach can easily be folded into other approaches. If that's,
sure.
We all, one thing I tell everybody is in these trainings is that the last thing I'm going to do is try and get you to change anything that's working. That would be the most non-solution focused thing I could ever do. Sometimes how things can come off in workshops. It's like, here's what you need to do. And sometimes maybe there's a subtext or maybe even more explicit that you need to really, re-examine what you're doing. Subtext, stop doing, anything that I'm not saying, and that's the absolutely last thing, I'd want to do. It's like you said, Ray, very easy to fold some of this into, whether it's CBT, person-centered, emotion focused, on and on. Yeah. And it interesting. I just talked with a client that was really concerned about adolescent daughter, and was going on about it kind of, and I was listening, and at some point in that meeting, a little later, I remember asking, "What do you appreciate most about her?" And he just lost it. He stopped and he said, and he's kind of a big, tough guy that didn't talk a lot, and he said, there's so much I appreciate her. And he's tearing up and he said, but I haven't even thought of these things in the last 2 months. I've lost track of, and he went on to just talk about, she was funny. She had this wacko sense of humor that he thought was hilarious. Really, when he stopped to think about it. So it again, it's, it's really easy to become what the narrative folks call problem saturated when we're in the midst of these problems. And so it's very understandable how clients can, literally a lot of these exceptions in these times when the problem may not be as pressing or even when things go pretty well, fall under the radar. It's like a perceptual issue almost. But that's the way. Problems. Problems have that kind of effect. Especially chronic problems, and it can really restrict the way we think and hope, and even constrict the way we see ourselves. Identity and things like that. So, this is a way to just kind of gently, at least, invite people to fan out and see a larger story.
And John, as you're sharing that and even kind of giving some of these examples here, just kind of the differentiation between the language that is, problem saturated versus solution focused. And I'm wondering, if I'm recalling, there was, I think, even a chart in the back of one of the first few chapters of the book that kind of gave some examples of, what some of our common go-to that problem saturated language is, and what some of the counterparts are for solution focused and trying to expand that lens and seeing the broader view. And I'm wondering, are there any examples that you can give that clinicians can maybe, recognize and work to exchange?
Yeah. I know which chart, at least I think which chart you're thinking of. It's a table in the second chapter where I talk about what I call just the basics of the approach. And And we're talking about things like, and again, now, to be fair, these distinctions are probably maybe exaggerated a bit to highlight the distinction. So this isn't saying that problem-focused counseling and problem-focused approaches are all this way, and or solution focus is all this way. But here are some examples. Some of the distinctions. It is shifting a focus from what is lacking, defective, and unwanted to focusing on what is available, working, and wanted. Okay, shifting again, not all or none, but just turning that lens is wide or narrow as you choose to, but at least a turn in the direction of from the causes of the problem and the complaint and the question of why to a path to a better future, and the question of like, what would that look like and how might you take the first step in that direction? From diagnosing and decreasing problems to identifying, detailing, and increasing these better times or exceptions to the problem. From being more interpretive to being more descriptive. So describe what you want more of. And less interpretation. This approach takes clients' statements pretty much at face value and works with what the client says, and not without trying to go way deep into what do they really mean, which I probably wouldn't be that crazy about if somebody did with me. I know you said this, John, but what you really mean is, and then they tell me what I really mean. It's like, wow, that hasn't worked well in my marriage or any other relationship. From a more practitioner directed to client directed, and some more radical ideas like this. The client is always cooperating in a way that makes sense to them, as compared to calling them resistant, which also localizes or situates the problem within the client when we call them things like resistant. And I mean, if we just step back, at least from my perspective, it seems like you have to be resisting something from the outside is occurring that you're so-called resisting or that you're not cooperating with. Well, that's a relational issue right off the bat. And so this resistance doesn't like somehow occur within the client sphere only. So and again, that's kind of a radical notion that whatever the client's doing, it somehow makes sense on some level to them. And so in solution focused work, I'm always assuming the client is cooperating in a way that makes sense to them, which I actually believe. But it also positions me, I think, to interact with them in a way that is probably more conducive for their engagement and participation in the process than if I were to look across the table and see, a large R written on their forehead for resistant. Now, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but these are things that have characterized our profession, and there are books written about, breaking through resistance and, cracking the client's code and, by using our expertise and those things, I think, tend to objectify clients in ways that are not just unhelpful, but are disrespectful and, some people might even say raise ethical issues. But so those are a few of those kind of distinctions and real differences between this and more traditional problem-focused approaches.
And in that last example, especially, I certainly hear how that turns away from the collaboration if we're labeling resistance. We're no longer working with. It's we're then labeling and kind of being more diagnostic in a way.
Well, yeah, and we're there's a lot of words that that are underneath that too. We're being hierarchical, we're being patriarchal, if you will, and we're basically saying, here, and you pat the client's hand and say, just tell the doctor, what's wrong, and sit back and I'll tell you how to fix that, and you just do what I say, and things will be fine. And if you don't, then we'll work through your resistance. And all those things are not done, I think, obviously they're done with good intentions. I perceive those as problematic when it comes to helping people change. And even if you can get people to change that way, I'm not so sure that's a good way for us to do it. So that's just, again, that's a more of a value. That's kind of a value-based perception of that kind of scenario.
And it doesn't use what they already have. It inserts a foreign concept or idea that hard to sustain. Yeah.
Yeah. And again, I don't want to convey the idea that solution-focused practitioners are just kind of like, if they have ideas that might help the client, or if the client says, well, I'm out of ideas and I came here to get ideas, so that's, and that question comes up. I mean, is there ever a time you share ideas with clients? The answer is yes, absolutely, but the difference is that sharing is by invitation and not, just practitioner, again, doing that, sort of taking that position that I just talked about, where it's like, just sit back and this will happen. And so, when I do share ideas, it's, well, here's something that, has helped, some other people. You're the best judge on whether this would work for you. I mean, that it's that kind of thing. And that's not done a lot in solution focused work. That if it occurs, it's all, it's a client directed approach. So, if a client says, give me ideas, I'm out of ideas, I'm going to do that. And I view that as very collaborative and cooperative. But now let's face it, most of the adolescents and kids that pop into our office don't sit down and say, lay it on me, doc, give me ideas. So usually take, sometimes, you just got to kind of meet them where they are, and where they are when they get to us is typically a function of some level of persuasion, coercion by some adult that said, you need this. And so again, putting ourselves in their shoes. And I often say to clients who really are overtly conveying the idea that I don't want to be here, and this is stupid and you can't make me talk, or whatever they might say, is I don't blame you, man. I mean, I can't make you talk. I don't like when people do that with me. I'm not going to do that with you. And I could, if I could put myself in your shoes for a second, I could think of 100 different things I'd probably rather do when I was 13 than sit in front of somebody like me. So but here we are, so, a lot of times that first contract, that contractual sort of language ends up starting with, well, I wonder what needs to happen for you to get out of having to come here, and that changes. that changes over time. But the whole idea is, again, this cooperation on our part, where we meet them where they are. But it's also interesting to kind of take in the fact that they are there. And if somebody didn't carry them into the office or chain them to the chair, there is a level of agency and voluntary control. And so that's another question too, and yet you're here. And like, what made you choose to be here? And a lot of times is, well, I didn't choose to be here. My teacher said if I didn't, I was going to get in trouble, or my parents. And it's like, yeah, you're still here, and nobody carried you in. And again, I wouldn't be that. I'm just trying to be a little bit concise in that conversation here. But nobody carried you in. And you're here, and he's like, well, then I'll lose this. And they say, well, and they're on my case, and I don't want it to get worse. And it's like, well, now, in my mind, I'm like, we've got something to talk about. So I wonder what needs to happen different for it not to get worse even. That's a starting point. That's a hope. That's a hope that we can work with. And what do you want instead of what's happening now? So, yeah.
So, John, as we're kind of coming to an end, unfortunately, so we don't want to take up your whole Friday to record here. What a kind of just transition away from kind of the overall solution focused approach, and kind of do a few takeaways for people as we're wrapping up. And, we often end by asking guests a few different questions. And first being, you've done all these things in your career. What keeps you psyched to keep doing what you're doing?
I love that question. Einstein, there's a quote from Einstein that says, never lose a holy curiosity. And the one thing that keeps me going, there are several things, but that's one that comes to mind, is that, this stuff is fascinating. This whole change process of just, and it's such a privilege to be invited into people's lives in this way to help them move in a direction of a fuller and more satisfying life. So part of it is just staying actively grateful for the privilege to do this work. But the curiosity part, to me, for me, has also just been something I've never really had to work on. It just sort of has just continued, and I'm lucky. Again, we go back to earlier in our conversation about, I feel very fortunate, grateful that, I found something that doesn't seem like work. Some of it's work, and it's hard, and it can be gut-wrenching and heartbreaking, and stories and circumstances that we encounter. But at the same time, I've never lost that fascination and curiosity about what can I learn more of to make me more useful to clients. There's that pragmatism again, useful, not how can I be a better therapist? How can I, so I try to keep that front center. So that sense that I think the curiosity and the fact that at this stage, and pretty much, even during my first year, I saw examples of people just even to keep things from getting worse was Herculean, heroic stuff. And I see that heroism on and on and on. Of course, I'm looking for that heroism, so I'm more likely to see it. And that's so inspiring that, it explains why I, even if it's tired, even if I'm tired physically, it's a long day or whatever, why I come out of a lot of these sessions feeling like I just more hope and energy and, life than I had before the conversation. So I don't know, Ray, if that's a multifaceted answer, but that's the best I got right now.
I think it's a great answer. I'm with you the whole way on that one. Second part of this is we're always interested in what people read and what they find is maybe like really good book recommendations. So other than your own books, if you could pick one book that you could recommend for people in the profession to read, what's one you would suggest?
So I'd say, again, this is a classic. This is a classic book, but I'm going to say Les Miserables by Victor Hugo, and of course it's the story really, and it's the story that draws me, and I can hear one song from that story and just feel it so deeply. It's the story cast in the French Revolution of a person who basically took it on himself to care for this child, and just climbed every mountain that was needed for this child to ensure her opportunity, to give her an opportunity to have a life that he was so committed to her having. And so I do think there are definitely ties in, to our conversation and really way beyond solution focused work. It's just this profession. I think, again, we get to be, a part of a journey that hopefully enables people to expand their possibilities and opportunities. And that book I think tells the story in a way that's just incredible. And not to mention the music, which is a whole other story. And I'll stop there. I was going to say
the musical is maybe one of the best that's out there as well.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. So I'll go with that one today.
Okay. That's a great one. And last question. If you could give our listeners kind of 3 gems or takeaways that you've learned in your career, what are 3 things you would share?
Listen, and listen. No, I won't do that.
I think those are 3 really good points.
They really are good points. Listen is top center, and it's certainly obviously listen to clients, but also listen to colleagues and hey, anybody we have a chance to meet, whether somebody at the supermarket, to colleagues at conferences, to the books we read, because I view that as a conversation. So, but mostly to clients, really, really, really listen instead of, this is hard to do, especially early in a career, but trying to be present with them and listen. That's, I think, the top takeaway probably. I'd say the second is, when in doubt, ask the client, meaning when in doubt at which direction to go, if things seem to be stuck, we seem to be going in circles, just put it out there for the client. I don't care if they're 9 years old, or 60 years old, you say, I don't know, we seem to be kind of, what do you think we need to do different here to kind of move things in a better direction? And the third is something we've already talked about, is just stay curious, find a way to do that. And I know that's one of those expressions that's like, it's hard to do sometimes. It's work can really, pound us down some, and it's challenging. But another way to say that would be try and never lose a sense never lose the ability to be surprised. So I'm always surprised by clients, and I'm just as surprised by them now as I was in my first year of work. And that's a way, I think, to keep us getting up in the morning and going into this work with a bounce in our step and a sense of adventure. That, hey, what am I gonna learn today? And again, that's not the purpose of the work we do. It's the client's benefit. But those are, clients, every client is different. And I'm constantly surprised in a good way. That'd be my 3 takeaways.
Those are great. So John, I really appreciate you joining us today. And, I always appreciate your friendship and the ideas that you come up with. And I seriously say every time I talk with you, I feel it leans me into a new direction in my own work. So I'm always appreciative of the thoughts that you provide. So thanks so much for sharing those with our audience. I do want to just give a little quick shout out before we end. John has a fairly new book, Solution Focused Counseling in Schools. And anyone interested in this work, I definitely suggest reading it. And even if you don't work in schools, if you just work with kids, I think it's just an exceptional resource out there. So I hope people check it out. And John, thank you for taking a Friday and joining us.
It's been such a blast to talk, as it always is, Ray. And I'm glad. And Paul, it's been a blast talking with both of you. And I think I do some interviews on this approach, and this was really a joy. And it's just the nature of the questions, and it just made it a lot of fun. And I also it's a lot out of these conversations as well. So I greatly appreciate it, and it's really great visiting with both of you today.
Thank you. And as someone who hasn't had a chance to know you before, but I have so much that I'm going to be taking away and applying. So certainly thank you for this Friday morning.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
And with that, we hope this episode got you psyched, and we want to thank everyone for listening. And just one more time, a really big thank you to Dr. John Murphy for joining us on today's episode and talking to us about solution-focused counseling. John, if our listeners are interested in learning more, is there any area that you'd like to direct their attention to? I know Ray just mentioned the book, but any other areas that you think would be valuable for our listeners to check out?
Well, I do have a website that is always in serious need of updating, but it is, there is information on the website. It's drjohnmurphy.com. I'm sorry, drjohnmurphy.com. And, I try to keep it fairly updated, but that's one resource. Is, LinkedIn is another possibility. And if anybody who has listened to this podcast has any questions that they'd like to ask me or explore things further, they're certainly welcome to email me at jmurphy@uca.edu. That's jmurphy @uca.edu.
Certainly hope they check that out. And if you're interested in hearing more and staying up to date with what's going on for Psyched to Practice, you can visit our website at www.psychedtopractice.com, or you can follow us on all major social media by searching Psyched to Practice. If you enjoyed this episode, it would mean so much for us for you to review our podcast on Apple Music or Spotify and sharing the podcast with anyone you know that's interested in psychology or mental health. Be well, stay psyched. The information contained in this podcast and on the Psyched to Practice website is intended for informational and educational purposes only. Nothing in this podcast or on the website is intended to be a substitute for professional, psychological, psychiatric, educational, or medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Please note that no professional patient relationship is formed here, and similarly, no supervisory or consultative relationship is formed between the host, guests, and listeners of this podcast. If you need the qualified advice of a mental health professional or practitioner, please contact services in your area. Similarly, if you need supervision on clinical matters, please locate a supervisor with experience to fit your professional needs.